getting excited now about what you're all reading. I'll go back to that. What we thought we'd do for this session is last week we did sort of choosing a passage. And so this week, rather than thinking about which passage we choose, I decided to choose two at the beginning. So we will do passage D and E, and we will concentrate on those. But just to get a sense of the whole paper and how the paper as a whole seems to deal with the theme of parting, I thought we'd just talk for like a couple of minutes about each of the passages. So we could just take one each, as it were. So does anybody have a favourite out of, there's actually 4 on there, but out of A, B, C or F that they would want to say something about?
I really liked B and F, but don't mind.
Well, why didn't you go with B then? Tell us. And what about you, Flav? What did you like? Other than E, we know.
Yes.
D, I mean, yes.
I also quite liked F. I thought A was interesting. I haven't read C. C would have been a skip for me in an exam, and I tried to give myself like 25 minutes to look at all of these so as to recreate vaguely the kind of thoughts I'd have. So I have no thoughts on C.
Okay. Well, in that case, if we go in order and I say something about A, and then you say something about B, Nicole, I'll say something about C, and then you do F. Flav, how's that? And then we'll go back to D and E, and we'll do them really quickly. So the sort of thing I thought was really interesting about A from the point of view of parting is that it's talking about parting from a place. So it's Phyllis Wheatley, the 18th century poet, writing this sort of elegy on a place, this kind of wooded area, and where she speaks of sort of sitting and kind of slightly sheltering away from people. So being a place where she meditates. And I thought in relation to the things that we were saying a bit last week, it very quickly is sort of about it's about writing, because there's a kind of way in which the poet is thinking of this meditative place out of which poetry is produced. So and at the end of the poem, they say, well, let's have hope, kind of to sort of almost like cast sunlight on me as I'm sitting in this little kind of mossy area, to kind of take me forward. And so then there's also the idea of the kind of completion of the poem as being a thing that holds her from being parted, because she creates the poem and then the poem creates the place, and that's the sort of memorial. And also that it's got this the fact that she's sort of talking about Synthio, because I love the footnotes, and talking about the use of the lyre, and using this kind of old-fashioned term for music, so that she's very kind of self-consciously talking about performance coming out of the sort of gods of creativity, but also gods who are associated and kind of embedded in nature. So in a way you could say as a first poem about parting, it's actually quite a hopeful one and a creative one. So I thought that was a kind of interesting beginning. It sets us off in a direction that we might not necessarily expect from parting. So Nicole.
Yes, so wait, could you scroll down a little bit just so I can see thank you. So I thought this one was really, really interesting. I think the fact it's like a letter and you've got that kind of like private address to a specific person is interesting. But like within the letter, you get this sense that, especially towards the end, he's sort of like approaching a parting from life. And so you get the sense he's like, write to George, do all these things, like, and there's this sort of awareness that you might not be able to write another letter. You've got that kind of like consciousness, I think, which is interesting. And the bit that I found really interesting was the sentence where I have an habitual feeling of my real life having passed and that I am leading a posthumous existence. I just think that kind of like sums up the whole letter, and he's kind of writing almost as if he's already dead in a sense, which I think is really interesting in terms of parting and the way that writing can sometimes try to kind of process the parting before it has fully happened. And there's this kind of like blending of like time in that sense. There's this kind of sense of the future, and then that also links to the bit at the end when he's talking about like a note to my sister who walks about my imagination like a ghost. So she is so like Tom. So you've got this sense of like the past kind of seeping in as well. And past people who've parted sort of staying with him. So yeah, I just thought it is interesting in terms of that.
Lovely, thank you. And Flav, you said you thought of Keats. Does this letter kind of chime with those things, that he's a kind of parting poet, as it were?
Yeah, definitely. I think particularly in the second half, where I think he makes us realize how external of a process death actually is, and how it can affect the world around you in many ways, and it isn't necessarily, despite all of the feelings being very much self-contained, and the kind of internal engine of doom being very much like within you and in his poetry, how that can also affect other people. And so I think the bit where he just kind of enumerates the different people that mattered to him and his relationship to them very briefly, I think is quite an interesting way to just summarize a life and a whole like history of connections and experiences that he must have had with those people for them to be meaningful to him in his final moments. So I think that does chime a lot.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I'm always sort of struck. So I kind of always think he's quite funny. So a lot of his letters are quite funny, and that he kind of like tells us loads about his digestion, and I've got bad stomach, and it's kind of most unromantic poet. And it's interesting in a way also that the title sort of adds poignancy, because it sort of says this is his last letter. So it kind of makes it more for us in a way. We're told how to read it, with that sense of, yes, sort of prolepsis about, kind of looking forward to being past the past, as it were, when he's dead. Brilliant. Next one, please. The one that Flab would have skipped over. I missed so much. I'm just going to say, I love this passage. I'll keep saying that. So I really like the fact that this is for being useful for reading. I think it might be nice. Although I think 2 big pieces of prose might feel a bit heavy to do, because they're kind of like a whole page worth. It feels quite big. But I very much like the idea that this is sort of, there's a couple of different sorts of parting in this, and different perspectives, and that can be quite interesting to talk about. So the fact that Laura is leaving the school and going back home, and the kind of embarrassment of the child who's grown up and has kind of slightly outgrown her circumstances, but is still overwhelmed by embarrassment that no cart was taken to collect the luggage, just her sister, and that her sister's the pretty one, and so it's got all of this. What I love writing of embarrassment, but then also that idea of her passing from a place where she's not really been particularly happy and where she's been constrained, and then a kind of realization that she can actually move forward, literally move forward, and so like throws her hat off and just runs like hell straight out of the narrative, and is still running, and then we have this shift of perspective where her much more careful little pretty sister, is watching her go, and is kind of has got a little mini parting within that between the 2 sisters, because the older sister is running away and is moving on and can't be contained anymore by the embarrassment and all of the stuff which kind of surrounds her awkwardness of being small. And then that we get a sort of sense of Laura's kind of freedom as she kind of shoots out of sight. And also I really love that she ties her hair up. So kind of like, right, I'm going to be ready to do this for a good long time. I'm going to run a long way. I'm not going to get my hair in the way. It's a really nice kind of energetic idea of parting that she runs out of. So I think there's all sorts of kind of things you could talk about, physicality in this, and movement and perspective, and that it's very funny. And also about coming of age and growing up, which is nice, always nice to read. Moving on past D and E, could we just look at F, and then that's for Flav?
Yeah, so interestingly, a lot of what you just said actually links to F. So some pros and cons to reading and skipping. But I think the setting struck me immediately, just because it starts with a little personal address, which I think kind of adds that intimacy to it. But then the fact that we're really placed in the terminal, I think is very symbolic in that obviously it's an airport terminal and the title kind of gives that away, but also the fact that this is the end of a moment in their lives and it kind of terminates to some extent the intimacy and the closeness of their relationship. I think some things that actually stood to me, because it was the last one I read, is just that all of the poems seem to have some form of rhyming element to them. And I think quite a few of them are ABAB. So I thought that was interesting in potentially saying something about the attempt to beautify a really painful moment and the attempt to kind of obviously capture it in poetry so that it immortalizes it slightly, but then also to try to make it prettier on paper, and to erode away all of the painful bits and kind of re-emphasize what really stands out as like the beautiful moments of it. So I thought that was interesting. And then the role of time kind of stood out to me as my second point, just because I quite liked the line that ends the second stanza, "I am the past, and that is all." I think this idea of a person encapsulating and embodying something so abstract as kind of temporal progression can be quite interesting. It reminded me, I don't really remember where, Nicole, you might know, it might have been a Barbie reference, but I don't know, of just this idea that like, oh, mothers stand still while daughters like grow up. Is it Barbie?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That is kind of what I had going on, especially towards the end. But to make that slightly more literary, you can always just think about this kind of cosmopolitan experience and how that is an intergenerational difference. This idea of like stasis and having a provincial, parochial, detailed experience, as opposed to something that's slightly more outward and travel based and kind of going outside of one's comfort zone. And then my final thought was just around a new interpretation of parting, and not necessarily strictly pertaining to like departing or leaving or saying goodbye, but this idea of actually sharing in something, so kind of being two parts of one, and what else you might share in, so whether that's love, time, space in each other. It just kind of reminded me of all the ways we use parting in our day-to-day life. So this idea of like, we can't be a part, or you are a part of me. So I thought that was an interesting new way to approach it. And there was a particular line that gave me that interpretation. Yes, but you and I in part are one. So yeah, this idea that you're never really parting because you are one experience spiritually, but physically there is obviously a separation. So you could always take that down a consideration of how the soul and the body might experience that parting in different ways. But I did also like that it was very much framed by the airport and by the symbolism of planes and this kind of vertical like progression of it in a way. Yeah, they were my thoughts on that.
Very nice. And I love the kind of fact that because it's sort of this is the terminal, it keeps sort of suggesting, well, like at the end sort of saying it's the break. But the terminals are also like, electrical terminals are kind of like sparks. So the kind of idea, it starts with the terminal, the light, and then it ends with the terminal, the break. And there's something about a sort of a place which is an end being a place where lots of people go off from. There's so many interesting things about that idea of, I mean, I love what you just said about being a part together, as it were. Is a really nice way of, and the language kind of encourages you. And I think what you said about the rhyme as well, the rhyme takes you on but then brings you back. It kind of is doing that kind of, the separation is never quite happening because planes go and they also kind of come back as well. It's great, really nice. Makes someone want to read more Ivor Winters, I think. Right, so now we're going to go back and look at D&E. So shall we start with D? Because Flav and I had an exchange where Flav said, "This is such a great poem," and I said, "This poem makes me cry." So everybody who's listening and thinking about this writing, I thought this was great to read because it's so small. And for this and the next passage, the kind of longer one on the Vera Brittain one, I want you to kind of, as we're going through, I thought we would read them out, and then I want you to pick, everybody to sort of pick a word or a phrase or just sort of moment and think, what's my, kind of what's the thing that stands out to me, because then that could help you. That can sometimes be a really good starting point for you, something that really strikes you about the theme of parting and what you're reading. So do you want to read this one, Flav?
I would love to.
Thank you.
It'd be an honor. Okay. 17 years ago, you said something that sounded like goodbye, and everybody thinks that you are dead, but I. So I, as I grow stiff and cold, to this and that say goodbye too, and everybody sees that I am old, but you. And one fine morning in a sunny lane, some boy and girl will meet and kiss and swear that nobody can love their way again. While over there you will have smiled, I shall have tossed your hair.
Brilliant. Thank you. And you're right, Nicole.
Yeah, sorry, my
Everything
sister's
okay?
just called me like 3 times in a row.
I love that
So
poem.
sorry.
And that the poem is called À quoi bon dire? What's the point? As we're told in the footnote, just like to draw on the footnote there. So if we could then have a quick look at the other one. Do you want me to read it, Nicole, while you deal with
No, yeah, it should be good now. Sorry.
Right, okay. Are you happy to read? It's a big chunk. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I don't mind. Okay. After tea, for both of us a sullen, subdued meal at which we had joined his mother and an old novelist friend, I had to go to St Pancras to catch my train back to Buxton. I felt sadder and more listless than ever. So much that I had meant to say to him was still unsaid, and yet it seemed of no use to say anything more. He told me at last, very bitterly, that he didn't want to go back to the front. He had come to loathe its uncongenial monotony, and this glimpse of England and real life had made him hate it more than before. At St Pancras, there was no empty carriage in which we could talk for the few moments left to us. So we had, oh my God, right, Zach, sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna lose it. I literally don't know how to mute my laptop. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
If you do, we won't hear you. So that's the.
Okay, I did message it to say I'm in a meeting. Stop calling me. So yeah. I'll keep going.
So we know that. Yeah.
Okay. At St Pancras, there was no empty carriage in which we could talk for the few moments left to us, so we had perforce to walk up and down the noisy platform, saying nothing more of importance and ferociously detesting the cheerful, chattering group round my carriage door. I wish to God there weren't other people in the world, he exclaimed irritably. I agree, I said, and remarked wearily that I should have to put up with their pleasant company in a lighted dining car all the way back to Buxton. Oh, damn, he responded. But when suddenly the shriek of the whistle cut sharply through the tumult of sound, our resolution not to kiss on a crowded platform vanished with our consciousness of the crowd's exasperating presence. Too angry and miserable to be shy any more, we clung together and kissed in forlorn desperation. I shan't look out the window and wave to you, I told him, and he replied incoherently, no, don't, I can't. To my amazement, taut and tearless as I was, I saw him hastily mop his eyes with his handkerchief, and in that moment, when it was too late to respond or to show that I understood, I realised how much more he cared for me than I had supposed or he had ever shown. I felt, too, so bitterly sorry for him because he had to fight against tears while I had no wish to cry at all, and the intolerable longing to comfort him when there was no more time in which to do it made me furious with the frantic pain of impotent desire. And then, all at once, the whistle sounded again and the train started. As the noisy group moved away from the door, he sprang onto the footboard, clung to my hand, and drawing my face to his, kissed my lips in the sudden vehemence of despair. And I kissed his, and just managed to whisper goodbye. The next moment he was walking rapidly down the platform, with his head bent and his face very pale. Although I had said I would not, I stood by the door as the train left the station and watched him moving through the crowd, but he never turned again.
Brilliant, thank you. Sad. Now, for some reason, I think that if I got these two passages, if I decided to do these two passages, I'd feel I had to start with the Vera Brittain because it's kind of bigger and less, so less kind of concentrate. So I'd have to say something about this first in order to get my hands around it a bit. But what would you two do as your sort of first start if you were doing these two? What would you start with?
I think I had quite a thematic approach when I looked at what passages I might compare. So I think the first thing that stood out to me in both of them was time and the progression of time, and so I might start there. I do think I would have also started even within that kind of thematic description or talk discussion. I would have started with the bigger passage.
What about you, Nicole?
Yeah, I think I would have done the same thing, sort of starting with the bigger passage just to like deal with that first and like understand what's happening in it. But then I think what I was like focusing on first was sort of the relationships between the two characters and the kind of communication between them. That was kind of like my way in sort of like comparing those first.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, so both of you would be thinking about some kind of common ways of putting the two texts together. So kind of like thinking of a paragraph or whatever that was starting to compare them. So I think that's kind of really good to think. I think there's kind of definite guidance I would give. Don't write a page on one passage, then a page on the other, and then put some comparison. If you need a kind of almost a sort of practical way to think about it, don't get to the end of a paragraph without having mentioned both passages, unless it's a very, very short paragraph. So keep them both in mind all the time. So let's start with your kind of first ways in. So Nicole, do you want to start by talking about, so you would think about the kind of relationship between the two. So do you want to take between the sort of pair of people, as it were, do you want to kind of talk us a little bit through this one, and then we'll slip back to the D and think about it?
Yeah, so in this one, I thought it was really interesting, the kind of like difference between sort of what is said in speech and then what the narrator is sort of saying about how they feel sort of in the text itself. And I thought it was really interesting that there is a lot of language around emotion. So it's like sadder, listless, anger, like miserable, but then sort of what they're saying to each other, they're not saying those specifically what they are actually feeling. And there's just a lot of moments of things that are like so much that I meant to say to him was still unsaid. And there's this sort of like self-conscious kind of awareness that they're around lots of people and maybe can't say goodbye in the way that they actually want to. So I was kind of focusing on the kind of miscommunication between them in that passage, whereas in the other poem, I was thinking there was a bit more, there's almost like this kind of intuitive, more intuitive sort of understanding between them.
So you can take us up to the other one, take us back to D, so we can have a little quick look at D, and then we'll start with, thank you, darling.
Yeah, so I was thinking, particularly in the last line, compared to the other passage, so where it's sort of, while over there you will have smiled and I shall have tossed your hair, the author's sort of like saying that like they almost know what that person would have done, whereas in the other passage there's a lot of like language about, oh, he sprang suddenly and all at once, and there's sort of this unexpected responses from the person that they're saying goodbye to, whereas in the other one's a bit more so that's what I was thinking.
And how would you relate that to parting particularly? So what is it about, how does the theme kind of work in that? I really like that idea about the sort of like, there's a sort of certainty this will have happened compared with keep walking past, kind of going past each other. How does that work in relation to parting?
Yeah, I think it was interesting in the sort of first in the second passage. I think there's almost an awareness of like how they want to part, like they're kind of that they're sort of trying to fit into those conventions of how you would normally part in a train station. So they're like, oh, I'm not going to look back at the window and wave to you, and there's kind of an awareness like, oh yeah, that's what you're meant to do, but it doesn't really happen in that way, which I thought was interesting. So they're kind of like trying to part in that conventional way, but sort of can't meet it because they're not kind of expressing things to each other. Whereas in the other passage, is almost like, I think there's more acceptance of parting in the second passage, I think, just in the sense that they kind of understand each other, whereas in the other one, because they've like had this frustrated like letting go, that parting is more painful, is how I would link it back.
Yeah, no, I like that. Good, really good. Yes, I like the kind of, so almost like a sort of sense of that parting is something which sort of in the prose passage almost about something happening to them and slightly it's been taken out of their control. So any planning they had is not working, and they're kind of drawn along by people parting as if that's a typical thing. And in this one, it feels more as though there's a kind of overarching kind of sense of understanding, almost a sense that the speaker is kind of, I'm understanding things better than the people who might read this. A kind of a sort of confidence in a way. Flav, take us in.
Yeah, so my way in would be through time. I think particularly looking at how time is kind of marketed throughout the entire passage, I think the discourse markers are really interesting. So the fact that it starts after tea, and then we move to by the start of the next passage to St. Pancras, and then suddenly in the first few words of the next one, and then really interesting kind of awareness of time where at the end of the penultimate passage we have there was no more time in which to do it and make me furious. And then obviously we have and then all at once, and it ends on but he never turned again. So I think the way that it kind of runs you through the passage would be the reason I would start with it, just because I think it would allow me to kind of have an overview of the entire passage and then potentially zoom into certain moments. I would potentially interestingly start at the end, just because it ends on again, and I think it's really interesting that again also makes an appearance in the final stanza of D. And I think it's interesting to think about how that kind of repetition of time can also kind of be parallel to the repetition of love, and this idea that both are very transient and both will naturally progress and both are inevitably going to come to an end. So I think I'd be interested in kind of exploring how like how human relations and love are kind of contained and limited by time in certain ways, but also to think about how love can kind of transgress all of the tenses. And so it starts after tea, which seems present, but it's also related to the past and what's happened. And I think the implications of tea being so kind of comforting are also interesting. And then you also have things that are slightly more urgent, like Nicole pointed out, like this suddenly, this idea of being furious about how time is running out. The fact that time itself, I think that metaphor is interesting in itself, that this idea of time running and then us running to catch up with it, or us running alongside it, is quite interesting. So that would be my way in. And then kind of if you wanted to make a comment about it from a slightly more removed point, I'm also thinking about the very brief information they give you at the top, which is the fact that this is obviously kind of about World War One parting, but it was written in 1933, or published in 1933, and it's a testament and a memoir kind of description. So maybe to think about how that frames it for us knowing those things, but also how the writer might be exploring their own experiences so much later, and how recounting that experience 15 years into the future can kind of impact the way that it's being presented, and it might kind of retrospectively influence the way that those characters are being depicted, in that obviously they have an awareness of time and have an awareness of all of the conventions that they should be adhering to, but maybe how much of that is actually being imposed upon those characters from the perspective of someone 15 years into the future who might have had time to ruminate on all of those feelings and actually come to an agreement or a judgment about how those two people would have fit into a wider kind of schema of the train station.
Yeah, so something interesting about the kind of being sort of separated from the moment of it happening as well, and insofar as it's a memoir and a testament as well, that it's kind of trying to replicate it. But and how does that work with what's going on in the other passage, and where we feel situated, both in time but also in relation to that sense of the kind of how the poem is how the poem is kind of presented as a packaged, as it were.
Yeah, I just think it kind of takes us through it. So the fact that it starts 17 years ago, it kind of transports us back to kind of when they first met or whatever experiences they might have had in their youth. And then I quite like the certainty and the specificity of 17 years ago, especially in comparison to the unpredictability and uncertainty of one fine morning. I think that's a really interesting phrase, in that it's asserted quite confidently that it will happen, but the time or the location seems quite clear, but the time of it doesn't. And so there's something predictable about the unpredictability of love in a way. There's something really certain about the uncertainty of love, and potentially how those two are kind of connected by this idea of inevitability of both time passing but also parting. So I think that's how I would bring it in, but also very interesting that those two, again, kind of seem removed, in that there's an awareness that they're growing stiff and cold, that everybody else thinks that one of the lovers is dead. And yeah, they're holding on to the past as a way to kind of hold on to their youth, much in the same way that passage E is titled A Testament of Youth.
And what would you say about, oh well, two things. One, the last stanza being some boy and girl, and also not necessarily related, but what's the point being the à quoi bon Dieu being the title of it. Is there anything? It's not really paratext, is it? Those things, but the kind of so something in the poem, then something about what we're being sort of directed to think about when we begin the poem.
Yeah, I think the lines that stand out in the first two stanzas are "but I, but you," because it very much separates the lovers into this kind of defiant, mutual but very unique understanding that they must have of each other. And then I like that all of that separation is kind of closed and brought together in one line, the final line, which is the longest line. And not only are they brought together on the same line, kind of only separated by a comma, but also it ends on one that brings those personal pronouns together, and in "I shall have tossed your hair." And I think the fact that they're then kind of applying that framework to some other boy and girl makes it very much feel like love is kind of a mold that everyone fills at certain points, whether that's in the kind of site and the ground upon which they experience it, in that sunny lane where they have had all of these experiences, this kind of like place memory concept. And I think it kind of depicts it as a young naivety thing where love is obviously such a universal, intergenerational thing. And yet when you're in the moment of it, it feels so individual and unique, despite how ubiquitous it is. And everyone thinks, I think, yeah, we'll meet and kiss and swear. I think that kind of listing aspect of it kind of prolongs the naivety in a way, and it makes you think that what you have is eternal. And then actually the poem very much goes against that to say, no, that has ended, but someone else will think this again. And kind of appreciates the beauty of someone else thinking that again, despite the pain of it. So there's something about romanticizing the pain and being grateful for having had that experience, despite it being over.
Yeah, it's really nice. The things what sort of struck me, and I wonder if I could make this a kind of this to be the third paragraph of our joint ELAT, is so two things about the sort of appearance of the poem, and then some things in sound in the other one. So in this, whenever I've read it, I've always thought that something could be missing, but so almost deliberately missing. So, and everybody thinks that you are dead, but I, and so that it's not necessarily everybody but I, but also but I, and then there's this sort of gap, which is a sort of like a loss of memory or a gap of parting. And then the same happens, and everyone says that I'm old, but that it could go on, and it goes into the sort of white space. And also oddly, in a way that I seldom think about this with another poem, the way that the I of I acts very much as a kind of like a sort of a wall or break, because we get this kind of but I, and then space, and then so I, as I, which then keeps drawing your attention to the fact that I is a downward stroke, and sort of like makes a kind of gap, bits of the poem, which is introduced by making but I at the end of the first stanza. It sort of alerts you to it and makes you look differently at the letter I. So oddly, where one might expect a poem to think much more about the resonance of sound, it feels quite sort of visual to me. Whereas the other one, the prose, I'm kind of quite interested in the way that, I mean, both of you have mentioned this, but the fact that there are kind of moments where, a whistle blows, it's almost like it's being punctuated by sound. And you said early on, Nicole, that they sort of don't say the things that they feel, and so they're saying very boring things, particularly that slightly awkward, again, the kind of literature of embarrassment, which is kind of like, well, and I've got to go home with all those awful people on the train. Oh, yuck. So it's such a inadequate thing to say, but then almost the sound of the whistle blowing twice kind of breaks through the language, the sort of mundane. I kind of wrote on this passage when I was looking at the kind of like their sense of the sort of boringness of the situation, and yet in the middle of it is the crisis of parting. But the whistleblowing is like a whistleblower, kind of like stop this on two occasions. And both are sort of like moments where there's a sort of parting in the text, and or a sort of parting of the text that stop it and make it and make make it work differently, as it were. And I think sometimes it can really help when you're thinking about the, I don't know, conversation, or I think it's particularly difficult with prose to think, okay, so what's the shape of it? What's the, what's the length of the lines? What's the, structure of the sentences? They're sometimes just kind of thinking, how is it punctuated, whether literally punctuated, or how is it punctuated by kind of changes or kind of interruptions of the structure. And in this, it is quite metatextually kind of working because it's sort of there's some sort of literal interruptions and or literal gaps, which seem to work really interestingly with the text. All of you who are listening, when I said to you, when you hear them read, can you think about what a moment is that you picked out? It'd be nice to hear some of those, and I might ask Flav and Nicole to kind of comment on the ones that you've chosen. They have to be different to the main things that something different to what Nicole and Flav have said would be really interesting. You had a completely different perspective on it, completely different way in, would be really interesting. So if you have things to tell us those. The kiss that's common between the two. Yeah, I like that. So if you were going to comment on that, how would one of you who would like to take the kiss?
I'll take that. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting because it is, obviously it's about parting, but then you have that like momentary like uniting again before they sort of go again. Whereas I guess like with the some boy and girl, there's a sort of sense that they're still together at the end. They're not parting from each other. And it sort of reminds the person who's watching them that they've parted from the person who they loved. Whereas I guess in the other passage, it is this kind of like desperate, almost like clinging, like not wanting to accept that the parting is happening. And the fact it kind of happens twice as well. This sort of like, and I think we clung together, and like clung is repeated twice as well, like clung to my hand, clung together. So there's this like clinging and not wanting to like accept that they have to part from each other. So
yeah. No, that's really. Oh, look, I'm loving this. This is ELAT in community. When they're flying up past the. Yeah. So the Flav, is there any of these which you particularly like that you can see, the kind of isolation, or that last line, you will have smiled, I should have touched your hair?
Yeah, I think kind of bringing those two together, actually, this idea that perhaps they're so isolated in the poem, but so together in memory. And the fact that you will have smiled, I shall have tossed your hair, isn't necessarily a concrete, vivid memory, but it's this kind of certainty that that must have happened at one point in their many meetings, or that was so common for their meetings that it was almost certain that it would happen. And that those kind of experiences also punctuated their connection in many ways. Yeah, I think I'd bring those two together to think about how the lovers can kind of be separated by the structure or by the poem, whether it's separated by the speech, the different speech and the space in between it in passage E, or whether separated by the stanzas or by a comma, for example, in the final line of passage D. And they have that kind of visual intratextual separation, but then from an extratextual point of view, we can only kind of think of them together, and they have this kind of symbiotic development where we don't really know what they're like because they're so contained. We don't know what they're like as individuals, and so they're also isolated in the poem, but in our thinking and in our reception of them, they can only kind of be perceived together, just because there is again this kind of parting or a part of one. We can only kind of process and digest them as one being, one entity of love. And I think it's really interesting that like the person who picked out like the I. I think there's this kind of construction of safety, this kind of like love bubble in both poems, where there is this everybody in D, there's everybody thought you were dead, or there will be people after us in the same space, but actually there's this kind of bound spatio-temporal bubble that we're both in right now. And then that comes up again in E, where yes, there's trains and whistles and the embarrassment of everything else, but also there is like a moment at which all of that turns and they get too angry and frustrated and they just forget all about the PDA embarrassment and they just go for it. And so I think there's something about like that safety that kind of brings them together despite their isolation. So in many ways they're isolated from each other, but they're also isolated from the world together.
Yeah, it's really nice. Yeah, I really like that. The kind of there's something kind of awkward in that. I will have tossed your hair to me. Which
I can't picture it, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, no, it is beautiful, but it's kind of like, well, you might usually think of somebody tossing their own hair. So somehow, whenever I read that, I kind of think it's more intimate because it's like more like something that somebody would say. Somehow it feels like it's more precise. So there's that kind of like there's the world in which people are kissing in lanes all the time, and then there's this when I do that thing which is slightly odd. And I think you've both at different times said things about the kind of distinction between the kind of others and the I, and that there's a sort of separation there going on in the text as well, which I think is really interesting. Yes, we haven't addressed the what's the point, as me points out. I mean, very politely by saying it's a statement and not a question. What do we think the point of that? What do we think that is going on there? Why is it called What's the Point?
It's Latin, right?
French.
French, not Latin.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking it kind of comes from, like we've said, the experience of kind of the other passage being very like in that moment still, and sort of in that moment of like being in love maybe for the first time and like feeling like that's like the biggest thing in the world. And then the other poem seems to come from that experience in being able to sort of like look at the like concept of love and being in love with someone from a sort of like distance perspective. So they are sort of saying maybe what is the point of people sort of being in love if they're only going to like part and feel pain. But then I think the poem kind of answers itself in a sense, because yeah, it sort of answers itself because they kind of say the point is that, you know, you can kind of look back on those experiences and have that understanding and acceptance once you're through to the other side of it, I think, and those memories still sort of stay with you even if the actual moment itself doesn't. So that would maybe be my interpretation of that. But
yeah, that's really nice. And I am loving, there's such lovely things written in this in the margins here. So to add to Ursula's lovely point, thank you, that's very nice. The kind of idea that death brings them back together. So a kind of a real sort of paradox that death is more united or more uniting than the mere separation on the train, that somehow there's more kind of absence suggested by the Fear of Britain than there is this sort of, you know, kind of whether you die or not, there's kind of what's the point of worrying about death is also maybe a kind of what's the point element there, the sort of the being something more eternal. Yeah, the sort of cynical. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? The title sounds cynical in What's the Point, but it's but as Nicole says, it's answered by, well, this is it, and the poems, yeah, the kind of expression of the poem is the point. See if I can take anything else.
I think there's also like a certain paradox that the title creates in many ways for D, just because the fact that it is apparently French, I think obviously associates it so conventionally with romantic languages, romantic places, and I think it kind of very much endows it with a grand quality. This kind of, you know, it transcends language barriers, but also Paris and the city of love and that kind of grand thing that we think of love to be. And then actually, in the way that the poem answers that kind of inquiry, it's very understated. It's not necessarily over saccharined. It's very tender and soft and actually very intimate, despite all of those kind of grand global love concepts that we have. So I think there's also something in there that kind of speaks to how intimidating love can be from an external point of view, or before you are in love, and then how natural and organic it might feel when you're actually there in that moment. And I think that also speaks to this insider outsider kind of binary that we've constructed. So that might be a nice way to bring the title in to inform that as well.
And somebody, Pippa mentions the kind of to this and that, and I think that's really nice. The kind of like all that. So in a way that all that in the Vera Brittain, they can't escape from, because they feel they finally do, I suppose, but they feel constrained by all of them. But the this and that seem just like just those things, like everybody else's lives and everything else. My age, and kind of all of the stiff and cold stuff is also. I'm saying goodbye to all of that. Feels sort of more confident. How would so I'm kind of conscious so if we put together your paragraphs and the paragraphs would have come from the ideas in the margin here, then we'd have a fantastic ELAT. How would we finish it? What would be our conclusion?
I'd have such an existential crisis with this. I feel like it would end in some kind of postmodern nihilism, nothing means anything kind of moment for me. But in the constructs of a 1 hour writing process, I think a nice way to bring it together is potentially inspired by one of the comments, is that parting isn't ever really a parting. And whether we think of that as kind of the spiritual unity that is left, or whether the poem is actually what ultimately brings the people together, or whether they are reunited in death, as someone said in the comments. I think my concluding kind of thought would just be that in the same way that parting is inevitable, memory is also inevitable, and this kind of longing after, or this kind of residual emotion and memory, all of those things, and nostalgia and the love of that moment aren't ever really going to expire. So yeah, just how kind of limiting parting can be as a single moment.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I mean, I often say to people, when you're in the interview and you're asked to kind of look at a poem, if you just look really clever, have a really clever look on your face, look up and say, is this poem about writing? The answer will always be yeah. And there is a way in which it's a nice way to end a poem by kind of thinking, okay, so if this is about an absence of something or a lack of something, the poem in the end is, I mean, that first poem where it's kind of like, I'm going to sit down here and this poem is going to be made out of this place and that's not going to be lost and that's hopeful, is sort of present in what you both spoke about in relation to the Testament as well, and the kind of making of the poem. So I think that's a really nice way to kind of finish and make oneself self-consciously think about the product, the poem or the piece of text that comes out of it. And Nicole, how would you?
How would I conclude? I mean, similarly to Flav, I think, just based on this discussion. But yeah, I think I would maybe tie it back to the communication thing that I was talking about, like at the start, and then kind of tie that into the idea of writing and sort of parting being explored in both of those pieces in this kind of retrospective way, and the writing almost an attempt to come to terms with that and understand it properly from a distance, or like with the second one to add more, like to add the things that weren't said, but you can never say them, but writing is that kind of attempt to deal with that. I'd maybe bring that in as well. But yeah.
No, that's a very nice way of thinking about it. I'm just thinking, so the fact that What's the Point is also was actually published in World War One. I quite like that. The idea, I was thinking, no, it's a step too far, but no, I quite like the idea that that there's a kind of maybe a suggestion of the being a context which we're drawn to remember of World War One, and the being the France and going to France. It's happening in the other passage. It's a bit of a stretch, but I quite like that. Particularly given as one of the first things Flav said is about the kind of like writing it afterwards. That it's a reflection on that. I'm still thinking about whether I think that's too much.
I like it.
Yeah, no, I like it. I kind of think one could be brave with it. I think that would work. And it is interesting we're kind of given a bit of context. We're given the date in order that we can think about what that means. And we very deliberately, the idea of the ELAT, one of the things I think is really interesting about doing it is that we give you the poems or texts, the pieces of writing sort of without context. We don't expect you to find context. In fact, we'd rather you didn't, because that sort of might make you feel like you're writing to a kind of requirement. But because I loved the Charlotte Muse so much, I looked it up. And she had I think her entire family ended in an asylum. I think she ended in an asylum. There was this kind of terrible, she had this really sad life. And it's possible this is written about her family, about her family loved ones rather than a lover. And so and then that opens, just makes you kind of think, ooh, kind of, there's lots of other ways in which one could read it, which it kind of opens up. And so there being a context which is not quite known can be really interesting for thinking about as well, I think, and how one follows that up afterwards. Okay, I want for once to finish on time because I always overrun. So thank you so much. I'm going to read back the chat, and I may pick up some more things that people said next week when we meet next week. What I want us to do next week, and I think I will choose one of the ELATs on dance next week, is to think about, particularly for us to focus on language and kind of really formal things. So to try to think as much as possible about things like rhyme, and that every point we make has to have some kind of language point in it, something about sentence structure or really kind of formal things, in order to make us do that, because I think that's quite a difficult thing to do. And you guys have very well drawn that in as you've talked, but I think to make that the center of what we do will be kind of helpful. As people have said, can I write one? If you want to write one and send it to me, I'm not going to give anybody a mark, because I am not in charge of marking the ELAT, and it gets marked twice. Sometimes it gets marked 3-4 times if there's disagreement about the marking. So that's a whole process. But I think I can guide you a little bit by saying we could do a bit more of this, maybe do it a bit more this way. I like this. So that they're the kind of comments that I'll give, rather than tell you what you will get in the exam, because I don't know. I think this was recorded, Neve, because a little red button's on.
Yes, Sarah was able to start recording it for us, even though she's on the train from a school, working very hard.
She's in Preston and she's not even here. That's fantastic.
I know.
Well
she's
done.
Just so good at her job.
So we have 1 minute left, Neve. What would you say about these two pieces of writing?
Me, a historian.
A historian.
Well, I quite liked reading what everyone has to say. I think it's really interesting the way all these things can be read so differently, and that's what I loved about doing English at undergrad, that everything, like nothing is really wrong. Even if someone thinks something is a stretch, if you can explain yourself, then you're never wrong. Like anything you see, nothing is too simple or too complicated, I suppose. Kind of shows so much about a personal student.
Yeah, it is that people have written some really good points, and lots of them are really based on quite precise things, which I think is really helpful and really a good way of thinking about it, and to then draw a point out of that. I think there's some really good stuff here, and people have done a great job. Great. I'm going to sit down and read those now. Thank you so much, Neve, for holding the fort there. And thank you so much, Nicole and Flav, for being brilliant as ever. We don't have you next week as well, do we? We've got some of you next week. No, I won't be here. I'm doing some Freshers Week stuff. So thanks. Yeah. Yeah, so we're a whole different troupe next week. So I mean, I'll still be here, like rambling on. But yeah, so we say goodbye to Nicole and Flav, who have been brilliant.
We are parting in many ways.
We are parting with you.
Exactly.
Except I'll see you like Monday. Obviously, Flav and Nicole did theirs 2 years ago and are now in their second year, so they're moving forward.